You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Welcome back to Music Tectonics, where we go beneath the surface of music and tech. I'm your host, Dmitri. I'm also the founder and CEO of Rock, Paper, Scissors, the marketing and PR firm that specializes in music innovation. This week, as we have just wrapped up the Music Tectonics Conference in person in Santa Monica, I thought I'd do something a little bit different and release a clip from our pre-conference a couple of months ago by Mark Mulligan of MIDiA Research called Crossroads, Streaming's Time to Choose. We had a follow-up to that at the conference with a fireside chat I did with Tatiana Cirasano, also from MIDiA Research. In this keynote on today's episode, Mark talks about the pressures facing streaming, from AI-generated content flooding platforms to Gen Z's slower adoption rates, and why the industry needs to move from optimization to revolution. We also open it up for some thoughtful questions at the end from you, our community, so stick around for that.
Now for our feature interview.
Now for our kickoff keynote. When Mark Mulligan speaks, he shares thoughts you've never thought before, but you find yourself nodding along as if you were about to think these thoughts because they make perfect sense. He expresses a future for the music industry based on the research he and his team do all year long. He anticipates what's going to happen next and fills in the holes for the rest of us. This time, he has thoughts on music streaming. He calls it Crossroads, streaming's time to choose. Streaming is reaching its height, but what comes next might be unexpected. Are you ready? Here to set the tone of our 7th annual Music Tectonics Conference, please welcome to the stage MIDiA Research's founder and music analyst, Mark Mulligan.
Hello. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Great to be here again. And a little bit of trivia for you, Dmitri, on narwhals. In 2019, a UK citizen fought off a terrorist with a narwhal tusk. There you go.
I did not know that.
Right, now let me get this swiftly moving gear. Let me get my presentation up and running. So here we're going to go. It's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster, and it is going to be very much a setup for Tatiana's presentation when for all of you are going to go to the conference. And if you weren't planning to go to the conference, if for no other reason, you should go to see what Tatiana is going to present. We, as I'm sure you'll know, we're constantly immersed in the industry and data and analysis, etc., but we've been doing something, Tatiana and I have been doing something a bit different this last few months. We saw how much of an impact our bifurcation theory had about a year and a half ago. And we're essentially trying to work out, we are having our awkward second album moment. How do we do a follow-up to bifurcation? And so what we decided was actually, what we really need is looking at what is the future going to hold, A, for streaming and B, for record labels. Now, we're not really thinking about what does 2026 or even 2027 hold, but really beyond that. And so what we've been doing is we've been talking to all of the leaders across labels and streaming services. We've still got a few more interviews to go, but on the streaming side, we've spoken to everyone and anyone. And that's given us some really great insight, which has been able to get us towards what we think is a unique perspective on where the streaming market is now, where streaming's leaders think streaming is heading, and then where we think streaming is heading. And so really what I'm going to walk through today is going to be sort of riding on the coattails of that to some degree, and then Tati is really going to sort of walk through where things need to go. So I'm going to start off talking about why change is needed. And that's why we're looking at things as a crossroads. There are two dynamics shaping today's music business. There are many, of course, but we think there are two incredibly important ones. One is financialization. Right? So there's been this influx of capital, sort of everything from pension funds to sovereign wealth funds getting into music catalogs. And then you've got the exposure to the public markets, Warner Music and Universal Music, public, a whole bunch of sort of bigger independents, public. And what this has resulted in is all the sort of things that happen when you get closer to big institutional capital and you've made big promises to big institutional capital. And this is not just a music thing, this is something that happens across the world. There's a really big difference between taking venture capital, which most of the narwhals here will probably be looking for, versus taking later stage capital Venture stage capital is we're going to do a moonshot. Let's go. Let's get as big as we can. We back you. We're buying into your vision. We're buying into your team. We think you've got a chance to change the world. Later stage institutional capital is we like you because you've got proven cash flows. We like it because you're steady, stable, and you've got growth potential left in you. And so it inherently creates a very different dynamic about how you do your business. The music industry, I think, over a lot this last 5 years in particular, but really over the last decade, has become more and more shaped by the influx of really big capital. I mean, it seems like every week or two, there's another news story about, oh, here another label or fund has got another 100, 200, 300 million dollars of debt capital to go and deploy it, but buying catalogs, etc. Of course, investors do not deploy money for fun or for charity. They deploy it because they expect returns and and there is more pressure on those returns now than there was before because interest rates are higher and all these sorts of things. So that's one of the most important things. And if you want sort of an example of how that looks, about 10 years ago, maybe sort of 8 years ago, we started to see this influx of sort of like new next generation independent labels. And this was like a real moment of opportunity for the indie sector. Most of those ended up taking really big financial backing. Now have become very successful companies, but they look a lot less independent, like independents, many of them, than they do mini major labels. Operating with the same sort of way and sort of focus on scale and growth, etc., and maybe slightly less of an emphasis of how a traditional indie might have on artistry, etc. So that's an example of how financialization changes the industry. There's no value judgment in that. It's just saying it is a different thing. A big financially motivated record label operates with different methods and different objectives than a smaller boutique artist-centered independent would. The other one is optimization, and optimization is really the number one reason that we're saying there needs to be change. Everything is focused on optimization. It's like, how can we make ARPU go up? How can we squeeze a bit more out of a slowing market? How can we make supply chains work better? How can we improve metadata? How can, all really, really important things. But what they are doing is fine tuning an engine. Whereas, if you think about streaming up to maybe even 5 years ago, it was about building a new engine. And if not trying to be sort of, doomsayer here, but, if you think about where streaming is now, it's been around for about 15 years. It's growing at a good steady clip. And there's lots of growth potential still in it. It's the dominant format. There isn't really a competitor. The main route to growth in developed markets is by raising the prices. Rewind to 1999, the CD had been around for about 15 years. It was doing really well, still had growth potential in it yet, but the main way of growth was raising prices. And then we all know what happened in late 1999. Or for those of you too young to know what happened, that's when Napster happened and the music industry went into a tailspin, which it took about a decade to get out of. We are not suggesting for a moment that we're about to have another Napster moment, although AI probably could have a chance of being it, but let's just put that aside for now. What we are saying is streaming has an opportunity to have another 15 great years. And this is, for all the narwhals, this is a really important thing, which, as you develop your business, you'll find that the things that get you through your first couple of years aren't going to be, in many cases, the things that get you through your next couple of years. What got you here won't necessarily get you there. And that's where we definitely think we are with streaming. For those of you who saw myself and Tatiana give our presentation, give sort of the presidential debate around bifurcation for the play versus listen at Tectonics last year, you'll have seen us make the case for streaming being an increasingly traditional incumbent on one side, and all of this cool stuff without any sort of particular home at the moment happening elsewhere, and creating these two lanes. What I'm going to make the case for today is how streaming can really try to carve out more of that play side of the equation to be part of its future. So it is a crossroads, but it isn't really just a case of left or right. It probably looks a bit more like this. There's lots of different directions. And crucially, we think that difference should be embraced. We would love to see 5 years from now, Spotify and Apple Music looking dramatically different from each other. Amazon and YouTube Music looking dramatically different to each other. They haven't been able to look dramatically different from each other because they were operating with the same pricing dynamics, the same financials, the same licensing terms, etc., the same catalog. So we think there is an onus on the industry as a whole. So this is not just, streaming cannot fix streaming's problems itself. Rights holders need to be part of that equation as well. There's not much data in this presentation, or rather there is quite a bit, but it's all on this slide. So if you're looking for data, this is your slide, and after this, there is no more data. And this is really to sort of try to set up. There are many, many things which are great about streaming, and there are many, many things which are not. And the pain points are tolerated as essentially the cost of doing business for all of the benefits that come with it. But there are things which are beginning to emerge that sort of show that things are changing. I won't go through all of these, but a couple which are interesting. There are 60 million people using generative AI apps, well, at the end of 2024. If you were to add together all the numbers that everybody says they've got, you get a much bigger number, but they tend to be registered users, whatever else. So this is people actually using the apps regularly. And that's a big number. I mean, the next big number, artist direct, self-releasing artists, is way bigger than the number of artists and record labels at 8.2 million, but it's still a fraction of that 60 million. So it's like every few years we get a step change in the number of people making music and the number of people getting music onto streaming services, which means that there's more music, which means it gets more difficult to work your way through it as a consumer, but crucially to work your way through it as an artist, because you're having to compete with all of this noise. And then when you look at how consumers are using streaming, it is not a coincidence that 70% of listening is passive. Because if it's so difficult to find your way through all of this because there's so much music and Gen AI making that even worse, then you're going to rely on the algorithm and playlists and curation and all those things to do that work for you. And yes, TikTok, great place for discovery, particularly, number one among 16 to 19s. But a quarter of people who discover music on social say that they don't leave social because they hear it enough from social and then they never go through and stream. So you've got this sort of disconnect happening between the parts of the ecosystem. And streaming hours is good, right? 6.6 weekly hours. It's one of the highest weekly hours for entertainment, but really significantly smaller than social. And social is eating the world. And social is, at the moment, the home of the bifurcation side of the debate. And we're seeing a whole bunch of artists who are opting into the social side of the equation. We've got 37% of music creators upload the music to social because that's where they feel that they can connect with fans in a way they can't on streaming. I won't go through all the rest of the numbers, but you get the sense here. None of these things are like, oh my goodness, the ship is about to sink. None of these things are industry breaking metrics, but you put them all together and it starts building up into sort of something that you might say could create some tectonic shifts. So the crossroads, there's maybe, if we want to really simplify it and ignore all the myriad different possibilities, there's two fundamentally different strategic directions streaming can go in: optimize or revolutionize. Now, the case for optimize, well, there's loads of things. More artists are releasing more music than before, so that's great. Label revenues are, sort of a huge part. Streaming revenues represent the vast majority of label revenues and significantly more than half of publisher revenues. Spotify's value is increasing massively. The global revenues are increasing massively. And most importantly, consumers have never had it so good. So is there really a problem? How do you fix a problem that doesn't need fixing? Consumers absolutely love it. More artists have been getting their music out than ever before. Record labels and publishers have this as their main income stream. So the case for revolutionize, well, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are not engaging with music the way millennials did. One of the numbers I didn't go through on the previous slide was showing how much slower Gen Z penetration for streaming is versus growth for Gen Z versus growth for millennials. Millennials are up 20%. So there's about 20% more of millennials are using streaming now than they were 4 or 5 years ago, but only about 9% more of Gen Z. It's just not appealing to them in the same way that it did for millennials. And then you've got fraud and generative AI flooding streaming. You'll have seen the Deezer announcement that about a third of daily uploads are generative AI. Now, it doesn't mean a third of listening is, but nonetheless, it does mean everything is getting overwhelmed and just absolutely full of AI slop. And so music listening is becoming commodified. It's like more and more music listening is happening in the background. It's becoming sonic wallpapers that we put on, even while we're sleeping. So we are listening to a lot of music, but we're hearing less of it. And the flip side of artists being able to, this democratization of access is there's so much music, people are struggling to cut through. This democratization is no longer working for people in the way that it should be. Now, you can, optimizing is what the next couple of years will look like, right? So if Supremium, if or when it finally comes, that's a product tweak. It's like Apple putting a new lens on its phone. It doesn't change the phone, but it's enough to go and get people to buy the next generation phone. You can have supply chain tweaks, sort of metadata improvements, crucially important. Again, it's fine tuning the engine rather than changing the engine, price increases and licensing. So that's the, optimize. These are all super, super important things to do. They're the things that will be the difference between, say, Spotify, Universal Music having a good quarter versus a bad quarter. So I do not want to diminish the importance of this stuff. But what it does not do is prepare you for the future. What it does not do is address factors like, well, how does an artist build a career anymore? How do consumers actually find music that they're going to fall in love with? How do we make sure that Gen Z start adopting streaming the way that millennials did? So the case for revolutionize, well, you're going to have to come to Tectonics to find the case for revolutionize, or catch the MIDiA Future of Streaming report, which will be out in a few weeks' time. But what I will do is leave you with one little teaser, one really, really important idea. It's a time for rate limits. So this is absolutely not without controversy, right? Because if I'm going to dumb this down, rate limits means less music getting to consumers, right? So who decides which music gets to consumers and which music doesn't? Does it just mean that all the big labels get everything and the small artists don't get that? There's many sort of what I'd refer to as like logistical moral factors that have to be worked through. But simply carrying on where we are, where there is no limit to what gets into streaming, that model isn't sustainable. It wasn't sustainable before Gen AI. Now in the era of Gen AI, with that third of music uploads being Gen AI, there is no other choice. A really difficult set of decisions need to be made. In the old world, there were natural rate limits. Factories could only produce so many CDs. There are only so many radio shows. There are only so many music reviewers. There are only so many TV shows. Now we've got a near infinite supply of content and inventory, listening inventory, but we've got a finite set of ears and a finite amount of time for those ears to listen to music. And so we are in the everything everywhere all at once era. It's time for the less is more era. And consumers are already beginning to cry out for it. If you look at the little indications, like there's more and more of people valuing going to small gigs and parties and, not filming it on their phones. You're getting, all this demand for exclusive access and, exclusive access to merch, etc. Why? Because when everybody has got everything, then the thing that makes you stand out is by having the things that other people don't have. So rate limits is not going to be an easy thing to roll out, but we have gone beyond the point where this is essentially an option. The good news is with our Tatiana's and my ears to the ground, we are hearing a real groundswell of support for moves in this direction. If in 2 years' time, rate limits have been set in place and it's killed off the long tail, but I will try not to take responsibility for that because that is absolutely not what we mean. And when you see the report, when it comes out, we've got lots of really intricate suggestions about how we make sure it's quality, not the size of the label behind the artist, that ensures where the different lanes are. And the last thing I'll leave you with, if you think this sounds crazy, really what we're talking about is having different lanes. Right, so think about, does anybody confuse a Netflix show for a TikTok video? No, because they exist in different places. But music has got the equivalent of TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and HBO and everything else all thrown into one place. Streaming wasn't made for that, and it can't support that. So I'll get off my soapbox now. That is the end.
You went too fast, Mark. And in fact, as a result, would you be up for taking some questions?
Absolutely.
All right. So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat as well. I mean, I'll ask you a question while we're waiting to see if anybody else is ready to come on mic or anything. You mentioned differentiation between the streaming services, and you mentioned this idea of rate increases, they don't seem like they're necessarily part of the same mix. But I feel like partly what you're talking about is a bit of a curation to keep people engaged, which was sort of what streaming services looked like in the early days, where there was some of this, was it called windowing, I think, where some tracks would only get released on one streaming service. And you see that on the video side. Interestingly, it has persisted on video streaming. It has not persisted on music streaming. I guess I could ask lots of questions about this, but I'm curious specifically, what are some of the differentiation that we might expect to see across music streaming services?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. And I think we need to have fundamentally lanes within streaming and lanes without streaming. So a really simple but really powerful illustration of how this can work in music. If you go into Beatport and you go into any genre, you'll see the chart and then you'll see a hype chart. And the hype chart is basically any record label that is below a certain revenue threshold. Only they are allowed to go into the hype chart. So what it does is it gives loads of exposure to all of these smaller artists and labels who would have never got anywhere near the top 100. So actually, by taking them, they can still get into the top 100, but they've been given their own place where they can be showcased. Because I think, one of the things that people might assume is like, okay, so if you're going to create a lane for smaller artists or whatever else, nobody's going to bother with that, right? They're just going to want to focus on the good stuff. But the hype charts in Beatport are a really good illustration of how that has given a platform for smaller artists and labels to be able to prosper. So curated channels like that within streaming would make a lot of sense. I think the streaming works really well revenue-wise and exposure-wise for superstar artists. It works really well access-wise for long-tail artists. They can find audiences. They might not get many audiences, but they can get audiences in a way they didn't. But you've got a sort of squeezed middle dynamic, which is what all of the bands who are neither tiny nor neither superstars, and it's like, they're the ones who are at risk of getting lost, and those labels as well. So a lane for them, and so as much as we can think about lanes within streaming services, I think streaming services also can decide which lane they want to major on. It's like in the report, we've gone and actually laid out where we think SoundCloud should go, where we think Apple should go, etc. All based upon what they've got at the moment. They've all got sets of unique things. Apple has got radio and documentaries and Apple TV and all these sort of things. And YouTube has got shorts. And you think about it, they've all got different things that if you put them actually together, you can create something that looks like a different music service. And they could have different sort of focuses. One could be way more focused on music for the over 45s and another way more focused on music for the under 25s. Doesn't mean that's all you do, but it can be your specialism. And then there may be, well, not maybe, there is an opportunity for things that exist outside of the traditional DSP infrastructure. When the bifurcation sort of approach, the economics of streaming, particularly with things like artist-centric, which fundamentally demonetize much of the long tail. Well, the long tail is essentially, streaming services have put this big notice up on their door, which says, long tail, you're not really welcome here. Or you can come here, but we're going to take the money from your songs and then give it to the big artists. We've just got our latest music creator survey back, and we asked long tail creators what they think about this. A, most of them didn't even know it was happening. And B, when you ask them what they think about it, well, guess what? They're pissed. So I think there is a real opportunity for somebody to build a new home for them. Maybe there's a new home for like traditional indies. Essentially, what we're saying here is it's time to think about designing a really differentiated and segmented music world, because at the moment really is a segmentation when you think about Spotify versus YouTube music.
Right.
People like them because of the brands, not because, and you can make a case, maybe final point, can make a case YouTube has slightly changed that narrative in the last month, where they've introduced really cool features like commenting and, liking and whatever else. That is such a rare move, though. Most of the Western streaming services are in optimized mode, not revolutionized mode.
Interesting. Okay, got it. So a lot of the differentiation will be around segmentation of who is your audience, what are you giving to them that's unique, and building audience around particular interest areas. And then maybe some features and some functionality will come from that as well.
Yeah, and you build it around the music. I mean, that's one of the things this financialization has done to music. It's like everything's focused on business model. Well, what about if we flip the equation and think about the music and then work out what the business model is you build around the music, rather than just saying it is a music business model?
You sound like a musician talking there. Hey, let's take a question from Ian Connolly. Welcome. Please introduce yourself briefly and ask your question.
Hey, my name is Ian Connolly. I spent about 20 years mixed between being at YouTube and Google and at IOTA, RIP IOTA. See a lot of familiar faces here. Been reading your work for a long time, Mark, and I'm excited to talk to you about it a little further. I did want you to ask you to clarify between rate limits versus rate increases, because it's not
Yeah.
entirely clear to me what you mean there.
Yeah, so when we talk about rate limits, is literally what are the ways that we can constrain and curate and limit the flow and put it into different lanes. So, for example, let's just say it was a streaming service that's saying we're just focused, our main focus is mainstream pop, and that's where, and that's the thing. So most of the stuff that isn't mainstream pop doesn't get pushed into all of the main playlists, and they might have other channels or whatever else, or they might essentially say to anybody who's not mainstream pop, actually, we don't really want your music here, go and find another place. And you might say that sounds really crazy, but if you look at streaming services, they don't all have the same catalog. They've been quietly differentiating a bit already.
Cool. Awesome.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ian. Nick Sincaglia, what's your question?
You mentioned that it's a controversial thing to have multiple lanes, and I agree. And the data kind of shows that something's got to change. I was thinking that the two lanes would be so controversial that the DSPs would be reluctant to want to do that. So what I was thinking was going to more likely happen would be the DSPs would put pressure on the distributors to slow things down. So there might be more requirements for metadata, things like, ISNI numbers for all the ISR, all the artists, and, make sure all the, publishing is there, and just load more and more requirements for slowing things down, getting the metadata in place. The AI companies, they want to industrialize content production. So that slowing down doesn't work for them. I've also started to see pressure on the distributors to, if they have a large number of tracks that don't get any streams or get a very low amount of streams, suddenly their rating as a distributor starts to go down. So I've seen incentive systems there. I was just curious what your thoughts are with some of those ideas.
Yeah, totally agree, Nick. I mean, in the report, we actually put a huge amount of the onus for change on distributors themselves. And, if you think about it, distributors of smaller artists, independent artists, and the smaller indie labels, etc., and they are having a bit of an existential angst moment, right? With things like, artist centric and the fraud fines, and, a whole, as you said, there's been a whole bunch of things which are just making it harder for them to operate the way they used to. So they are having to already think about, actually, maybe we focus more on identifying good talent, working to make that good talent as best it can be, and actually starting to sound a lot like a record label. So I think you're right. The change is already there, which is part of the reason why we're talking about the lanes. We already see the foundation stones are being laid. But I think human curation we think there is a massive role for human curation to play, both at supply and demand side. So at supply side, the distributors need to work out how they make sure the best music is the stuff that gets onto the streaming services, and the other stuff maybe goes on to social or wherever else. And you can put quite simple mechanisms in. They already have different tiers of paying customers. So maybe, if you want to be considered for streaming, you have to be on one of the more expensive tiers. Now, none of these things are going to be clean, right? What about the struggling musician who can't afford the better tier and they're making great music? We're going to have to work out, ways to fix those things. But at the moment, the great musician who can afford the really cheap tier still isn't getting heard because they haven't got an ability to be able to cut through the clutter. So yes, I think at the supply side, big onus on distributors, but also labels to be, sort of more focused on quality rather than quantity. And then on the demand side, one of the things we think is a really big opportunity is bringing in like crowdsourced human curation, where talent floats up. You'll have to put in, mechanisms to make sure payola type dynamics don't come in. But, one of the things that we know has been in the history of the modern recorded music business is tastemakers play a really big role. And yet when you look at streaming services, where do you see the faces of tastemakers? There are tastemakers behind some of the playlists, but it's fundamentally been dehumanized. And in the age of AI, I think we have a huge onus on rehumanizing music.
Awesome, Nick. Thanks for the question.
Thanks.
We have about 5 minutes still. We've got 3 hands up, and we also have a bunch of questions in the chat, but let's get the folks who have their hands up. Let's go real quick with the questions and see how quick we can get Mark to answer them. Julian, go ahead.
Hey, Mark. Yeah, I think I was going to ask you a question about that. Each of these conglomerates that has the DSP, that their particular streaming service actually has just giant ways of being able to explode IP. If you look at the way Apple TV just did with the F1 movie, I think at the moment it seems a little myopic to look at the streaming service in of itself and look at more like how can I blow out an IP because of everything. I mean, Amazon Music is Amazon is 48 different companies. So I understand the optimization of the streaming service, but it surely the route is around how do I use my other assets to drive the discovery and explosion, right? That's really the differentiator, right? Not that I can put stuff on there and I've got a rate limit, right? Like, yeah, I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so first of all, absolutely agree that, as I was sort of alluding to before, that most of the streaming services have a bunch of ancillary assets which pulled together could, create something really distinct. But the fact that those assets have been there, readily available and not utilized so far, is not going to be accident, right? There have been very clear reasons not to fully deploy all of those assets into music. And, if you, speak in really sort of basic, simplified terms, 10 years ago, music was what got Apple excited. Now TV is what gets Apple excited. So it's like if we're talking about, well, let's use some of the, let's use some of the stardust from, TV and all the assets that you built around making the TV shows and films successful. Let's go and deploy that to some of music. Well, actually, our focus is on TV at the moment. So I think and if you look at, Amazon, you imagine what it could be doing with, merch via, the store and Twitch and whatever else. But those things haven't been pulled together either. So what have streaming services done? They've just pushed other types of content into streaming, which is predominantly audiobooks and podcasts, but not only that. So I wouldn't say that it's a lack of imagination. I think it is a decision that their own music services are operating within very clear corporate lanes. But I completely agree with you. The potential is amazing.
Thanks, Julian. Steve, if you have a quick one, let's try to get Steve and Susan just to ask their questions real quick and get 30 seconds on them.
I'm going to do 30-second answers. So there we go.
Okay, Steve, you're up real quick.
My name's Steve Bassour. I'm a music and entertainment lawyer, and I do a lot of work in the technology space. So I'm a partner at Rains. I really agreed with what you said. I think of it in terms of growing the business, not fine tuning, like you were saying. Fine tuning's great, but we need to make music as relevant as it was in the Steely Dan days, and it just isn't as relevant as it was. And I feel like humanizing selection is a good idea. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on just any other thoughts on how do we grow sort of interest and engagement in music. My one big idea is reopening normal people sharing their playlists and stuff, sharing their likes on Spotify and other streaming services is a start to doing that. And then stars will start to develop from it. So that's the question.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've been writing a lot about at MIDiA over the last couple of years is the need for streaming to become more social, and ironically, not like social is now, because social has stopped being social. Social is now just entertainment. Social started off by building connections with each other.
Right. Not that kind of social. Like the original version of Spotify was a thing called Music Stream, and it was totally a social app about sharing and curating of music. So, sort of more of that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things I could say, but for the sake of keeping this quick, bringing in more social features, making the profile a place where you can, a phrase I like is peacocking. It's like you spread your feathers so you can show everybody what you like. You get badges for being the first one to listen to this and, all those sort of things. Yeah. Those are the things that can unlock relevance and cultural resonance for Gen Z and Gen Alpha.
Steve, thanks for bringing that up. It's a great topic. We'll be talking about it in Santa Monica, I'm sure, every single conversation. I appreciate that. Susan, real quick, please say hi and what's your question? Last one here.
Following Steve is great because we've known each other a really long time. And I just want to say I've been inspired by you, Mark, and your great work for many years. I think what I've been trying to do is do exactly that, reintroduce the idea of a socialization around premium content, whether it's sports, which I'm really focused on, but music and the creator culture. And it's sort of disparate on all these different platforms. But I think your point is, and somebody who pointed out the growth piece is media streaming is really the key. The question is, how do you, the linear approach and the search and the endless search on YouTube is not a curated experience. So I've been working on Thin Air. It's a new platform for media streaming that is a collective reality experience. So it's much more social. It's focused on live streaming and global media interaction, because music is also a very global place. Like we're looking at, trying to culminate all these different genres. So I wanted to just say that the business model underneath is something that I wanted to explore with you guys, is just not just based on advertising or rates. It's just all of the pieces in allowing artists to earn their own money.
Yeah, so what I'd say very quickly, Susan, I think you touched upon a really important thing, which is connection. And you think about the things that work, whether it's 12-year-old kid playing Roblox or whatever else, it's being able to connect with other people. And that's why live music is continues to be as big and as important as it is, because it is those connections. Streaming makes it really hard for you to have those connections. So that's why and the last thing is, if we're in the everything everywhere all at once stage, where actually connection, one-to-one connections, those things are scarce. So it's the bring back scarce experiences and connections with people. Then you make music have in the way that Steve was talking about, having a relevance and a resonance to younger generations in a way that simply just turning on Spotify to have something on while you study doesn't do.
Amazing. Thanks, Susan, for that question. Mark Mulligan, MIDiA Research. Amazing. Thanks for sharing your latest thoughts. Optimize or revolutionize? Tatiana and I are going to do a fireside chat at the conference to continue that conversation. She's here in the chat as well. Mark, always appreciate all the ideas and thinking you're pushing us on, and really grateful for you to be here. Sorry we won't see you in Santa Monica, but Tatiana, pretty good fit for us as well. So really good. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know we do free monthly online events that you, our lovely podcast listeners, can join? Find out more at musictectonics.com. And while you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference and sign up for our newsletter to get updates. Everything we do explores the seismic shifts that shake up music and technology, the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That's my favorite platform. Connect with me, Dmitri Vitsa, if you can spell it. We'll be back again next week, if not sooner.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.